Welcome back and to the fifth part of our archival description series for creating access through archival description. For those of you who are new to watching the videos, my name is Caitlin and I work at the Northern New York Library Network. If you are new, I suggest you go back and watch the first 4 videos as these are building on each other to learn more and more skills to create descriptions, so it might make a bit more sense if you've had the background. To those of you who have been joining me, welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about access points as they are defined in Describing Archives of Content Standard, or DACS. So let's dive right in. So access points are specific terms, codes, concepts, and names for specialized that come from specialized indices that are created to permit faster and more precise searching. So these are usually made by some type of professional or governing body, usually who know a lot about the topic that they're writing about. And as it mentioned in this definition that comes directly from DACS, which we'll go look at in just a second, these terms are a predefined way to describe something. So what do I really mean by that? So this group has come together and decided this particular item, we're going to call it this. Every single time we refer to it, we're going to use this terminology so that we all know we're talking about the same thing. And why is this important? Well, it helps us make sure we're all on the same page about what we're describing, what we're talking about. It also makes sure we get the same and complete results back every time we are trying to look for a certain type of an object. So for example, like, why does this matter? You know, if you were talking about something like a car, we all probably know if I say car, you have some picture that pops in your head. But is it the same picture as what I'm talking about? Somebody else might call it an automobile. So to a lot of us, it might kind of be referring to the same thing, but computers, as I've mentioned a few times, are not very smart. So if we have someone label a picture of a vehicle, here's another word, someone might call it a vehicle, someone might call it a car, someone might call it a truck, someone might call it cars with an S, someone else might write automobile. So we're up to 5 words that are all kind of roughly describing the same thing. And the computer is not going to know that those are all kind of the same thing. It's going to see them as 5 discrete types of information that are different. It's not going to know they're related to each other. So if we want to look up pictures of cars, pictures of automobiles, if we type in the word car, we'll get some pictures, but not any of the pictures that are labeled as vehicle, truck, or cars with an S. You know, it's only going to pull the exact thing we type. So that's why these access points, especially in the digital world, become extra important, is being able to use that standardized vocabulary, that same formatted word every single time, is going to make sure we get complete results so that we can either work with our materials to maintain them, maybe we want to pull stuff for exhibits, but also to have researchers find and discover our materials. So if we go over to DACS and we go to the overview of archival description section in the table of contents, we will see that it kind of gives us an overview of access tools and why they're lovely and how we can use them, as well as access points. And those are those predetermined words that I was just describing. And there's a whole bunch of information if you really want to dig into it. But as far as DACS is concerned, they are categorizing access points into 6 broad categories. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, is those categories and what kind of information you might want to put in them. So we'll go through each one. As an overview, we're going to talk about names, places, subjects, documentary forms, so think of that as like your material formats, occupations, and functions. So these are all categories of words that we might want to use to talk about our materials and make these access points to let people help find them more easily. So how do you choose what to turn into an access point? After all, we have a whole bunch of information. All those elements, we've been capturing all kinds of information about our materials. So how do we know what to now make an access point? So remember that we don't need to capture everything about the collection in our access points because we do already have all of that other description we wrote, such as scope and content notes, such as dates. And those, especially in the digital world and using computers, a lot of times those will be searchable as well. So you don't have to and shouldn't want to capture everything because it kind of becomes messy and actually even more difficult to find out what's important if everything is captured. So what we really want to do, our big goal, is we want to pick a few topics, and how many is going to depend on the variety and how big your collection is probably. So think of this as catching the highlights or the really big, important, what is this really about? What makes this extra special? What might be kind of rare or really interesting to researchers? So what are the highlights of this collection that we can point out to people so that they can find it and want to use it? So how do we know how to populate these access points? How do we know what of those, those special words I said, those predetermined words, how do we know what those words are? And as I mentioned, there's kind of index lists of these words. A lot of times these are referred to as controlled vocabularies. So again, those predetermined lists of words made by some kind of a governing body who usually has a lot of knowledge and expertise. And then again, using these words, like this is very important because it's helping with discovery and it's also helping us take care of our collections. It helps us be able to pull information quickly and efficiently and know that we actually have everything. So what are these predetermined lists? So not a lot, but some that we use regularly in librarians and archivists are things such as the Library of Congress subject headings, and you can see some of these in the pictures I have on the slide. Library of Congress authority files. There's also something called the Art and Architectural Thesaurus put out by the Getty. And then there's, if you can think of it, it probably has a vocabulary, any kind of subject, topic, anything like that. So the bottom corner is just one example of the many that exist. So this one's called Homosaurus. And this is a controlled vocabulary about any kinds of activities, words, terminology related to the LGBTQ plus community. There's also some for medical terminology. Again, anything you could think of, there's probably a group that's come up with a list of words that you can use to best describe things. So where are we going to get our controlled words from today? Again, this is an introductory course. We want to keep it simple. We want to utilize our resources to the best of our ability. So how are we going to do this? So one of my favorite things to do is to use existing catalog records. So if you work at an institution like a lot of the ones I've worked at, you don't have dedicated catalogers. You may not even have someone who's had cataloging training. So what you can do is give yourself kind of peer coworkers inadvertently by going to the websites and the catalogs of institutions that exist who are bigger and do have dedicated cataloging staff who know how to do it, know how to use these controlled lists, and are attaching them to records. So I really like to kind of mine data that already exists from other places to either get ideas or to snatch things that are useful to me. Again, kind of borrowing what's going to be useful to you from places that have maybe more resources than you. Of course, you can also go and search these controlled vocabulary lists, and we'll very briefly get an introduction to two of them today. They can kind of be a lot more complicated to use, so if you want to dive into that or you have some knowledge of that, feel free to explore and learn. For the purposes today, we could almost have a whole another class on controlled vocabulary lists and their quirks and how to navigate them. So today we'll just do a very brief introduction so you know kind of what it exists like. And then finally, the most important thing in all archival work is to be very consistent. So you could potentially not use a list that already exists out there in the world by professional groups at all. But what you could do at very minimum, that'd be great practice, is to make yourself a local list of things, words that you use a lot or that have to do with your collection, so you can apply here's what we call this every single time we use it for the categories we're going to explore. And sometimes this happens just because you have words that only apply to your local neighborhood and they don't exist on any other list, so you have to be the list maker. And sometimes if those big lists or those other catalog official terms are just kind of too overwhelming to use, a good starting point is just to be consistent with what you're doing in-house. Okay, so as always, we're going to learn about these access points through examples. So one being the Diana Denny collection that's already been described by the Library of Congress. So we'll see what they've chosen for access points. And then we're also going to look at the Desilu studio, so that television studio collection that's a little bit messier, that we're having to sift through a lot more information for us to make decisions about what we want to define as access points. So the first thing we're going to look at are names. So as you probably can already guess, I mean, it might sound kind of familiar because of the work we did with creators and things like that. These are the names of people, families, organizations, businesses, corporate bodies that either can be the creators of the material, so who made them into existence, who brought them together, or it can be the subject of the materials. So who is represented or what's represented in the work. And remember, we're talking about people, we're talking about corporate bodies. So in the Diana Denny collection, so remember, we're looking for access points. So they usually live kind of at the end of finding aids, or they're kind of tucked away, because again, these are terms that are used to access the collection, help find it, especially by computers usually. Okay, so here they're called selected search terms. You can see they give us a little bit extra information. The following terms have been used to index, so that's kind of another way they refer to them sometimes, the description of this collection in the Library of Congress catalog. They are grouped by name of person or organization, subject or location, and by occupation, and they are listed alphabetically. So they just kind of gave us a little overview of what we can expect to read next. So as far as names go, we're looking at two of these categories. We're looking at people, and we're going to look at organizations. So what we can learn is that the things they decided to highlight for this collection to make it pop up faster in a search, be easier to find, is the artist, which makes a lot of sense. She's kind of the main reason any of this exists in the first place. So there's Diana Denny, 1923 to 2015. So remember again from the creator when we were talking about formatting names, when we were talking about creators. That's her year of birth and her year of death. And then they also have a little extra clause on there that she's an artist. So maybe there's another Diana Denny and they wanted to make sure to point her out. So she's faster to identify and find. Second of all, we have an organization that has something to do with this collection. Apparently is important to highlight. If we read back up in some of the other descriptions, we might find out why. But and this is Scripps Howard is the official way to write it. And chances are somebody at Library of Congress went and looked in all those controlled lists to figure out exactly how to format the order and the punctuation and all that in this. So that is what we know about that collection. So now, if we want to figure out what to do with our Desilu collection, what are kind of the big highlights that we want to point out about this collection? What's really important? So the majority of the materials are all about the studio itself, so Desilu, so that's important. We could consider Gulf and Western, who they sold it to. So I highlighted that as something to think about. But it was the very end, and it's just when it got sold, so it's not the majority of the material. So again, we're just highlighting it to do some thinking right now, but we may not decide to use that one. Then we also, for the sake of this, are going to highlight the co-founders, because we know there's a significant amount of material made by them and between them. So that's Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. We also could consider some of the cast members that are mentioned at the bottom. For the sake of today, I'm not going to index or make access points for all of them, just because they're going to be a fewer portion of the material and to save us time. But if we wanted to, we could certainly index them too, especially since they are also famous people. They might be really great things to make access points. So what do we want to highlight for today's purposes? So we're going to highlight Desilu as a company itself, Lucille Ball, and Desi Arnaz. Those are the three big things I want to point out about this collection. So we're going to start, so how can we find the words we need? So we're going to start by looking for similar collections so we can kind of mine the cataloging done by someone else. And if we need to, we can go and browse the controlled vocabulary list. So I'm going to start by going, let me get to the home page. I'm going to one example of a place that holds finding aids, in this case for the state of California. It's called the Online Archive of California. And since I know that Desilu and Lucille Ball, and they were real people who really did do film production or television production in California, let's look in California just to see if there's anything. So I'm going to start by typing in Desilu just to see what comes up. And here's our results. And remember, these are all finding aids in this database. So we actually see there, the second entry is, it says the Arnaz, so Desi Arnaz papers. So that sounds pretty relevant. We'll at least have his name, which we want. So let's click on that. And the way that this database is set up, I'm actually going to go to the right-hand column and click on collection details, because again, I'm looking for those index words or those access points, which are usually at the bottom. So I'm just going to scroll. We'll see this looks a lot like the elements we've already been doing if we stop and read, but I'm going to get to the bottom. And here we find what we're looking for. So subject and indexing terms is what they're calling it. And we see they've picked a variety of things. But remember, we're looking for the name of the company, if there's a way to make sure what the official way we should write that is, as well as the names of Desi and Lucy. So we can see down here at the bottom, we have Desi Arnaz and his years of birth and death. Whenever you see those two dashes and another word after, that's a way that catalogers can kind of link more than one term together to make them more detailed, more specific. So we're not going to get into that now. We're going to keep our terms pretty simple, but know that that exists. So anytime you see kind of that double hyphen, that's kind of a new word that's been tacked on. So you can ignore it if you don't want it, if you just want the first part. So like for me, I just want his name and death. I don't need the extra detail of what they're trying to describe for this collection. So we also see Desilu Productions is down here. It's actually got the highlight on it from our search. So we're going to use that and ignore, it's called a cutter, that second level of detail. And then we see that Lucille Ball is here. So every word we want is here. Now remember to take the cataloging you find with a grain of salt, kind of check what institution's doing it, because a human is choosing these words and putting them in. So you may just want to check and make sure that the information is right, it looks right, but it's a great place to start. So I'm going to show you one other thing. So this is a way we can kind of check it. As an introduction to controlled vocabularies. So now we know what we think it should look like. We have Desi Arnaz with his dates, Desilu Productions, Lucille Ball with her dates. So I'm going to show you what the Library of Congress authorities look like. So this is a controlled vocabulary list put out and maintained by the Library of Congress. So I'm going to click on authorities. And again, it's a lot easier to mine other people's, but I just want you to know this exists, and I want you to know that you can find things in it, but maybe not as streamlined as searching other things. So there's different types of lists they have. So you can see in this search type, they have subject, authority headings. So it's like subject lists, kind of different categories. So name authority headings. So that's a list about names. This is if you have like famous people or well-known people, they're probably in here. If it's just someone from your local town who isn't really known outside of your town, they likely are not in this list. And there's a few other categories. So we're going to just focus, we're doing names. So we're going to stay in the name authority list. And if we hadn't found those names, or we want to make sure that the entry we saw is right, we can use this. And this search is not as smart or forgiving as something like Google. So if you spell anything wrong, it'll say there's nothing there. So you will have to fix your search. So you may have to rearrange the words you use and make sure your spelling's right. So I'm going to start by looking for Lucille Ball. So let's write her name. Whoops. This way to see what we get as a search. So I just wrote Lucille Ball. Let's see what we get. And you'll be like, huh, that's not right at all. Why do I see Lucille Francis as the first name? That's not right. And this is where I'm talking about it gets kind of fussy. So I'm gonna go back and do a new search using this button at the top. So we're in the name authority. So now I'm gonna write Ball, Lucille. Because Library of Congress loves things formatted in the way that it likes, which is usually last name, first name. So now let's see what we get. Oh, right off the top, here we go. Ball, Lucille, 1911, 1989. Is that what we saw in the other entry? Yes. So it looks exactly the same. Now the thing we want to pay attention to here is we want to make sure whatever we see next to it in this left column, we want to make sure there's something, that red button says authorized. If it says authorized, we know that is the official name we should be using. If you see something that's blank, or you see something that says references, then that may not be the format that you want. And I'm going to click into this just to double check. So we know this is the right person by the year of date and death, but let's see what else we can find out. So you can see we can go to something called the authority record, which is going to give us even more information about this entry, Ball, Lucille. So let's look at that real quick. You have to sometimes click through a couple of layers. So if you are used to library cataloging, this is called a MARC record, and it's probably going to look familiar, but don't worry about it if it doesn't. So you can see the important thing here is the heading. So that is the official way we'd want to write it. And if you want to double check that this is the right person, you can kind of skim all these other fields, and all these numbers stand for some kind of a field. I don't have them memorized, but you can look them up. But we can see Jamestown, New York, which I happen to know is her hometown. Los Angeles, which I know she did her career. I see acting, I see comedy. I see her middle name, which I know is correct. I see her married name from her first and her second marriage, which I know is right. So here's all these other words that are sometimes used or related to her. So there's all these connection points. So anyway, you can learn enough information to be like, yes, this is the correct person, and confirm that. So that's good. We know that. So something else interesting I saw is it says also look under, here's a related word, Desilu Productions. So that's another thing we were double checking. So if we go here, we can see in this heading, Desilu Productions is the official name. We know it's related to her because that's how we got here. And here's television program production. And we can see the founders, and we know all the information's right. So a lot of times you just want to make sure you have the record about the right thing, because some things could share names and be a little bit funky. So what did we learn? We learned that our snooping in that other catalog, they had done a very good job, and we can use those words we saw. So most of the time you can trust the cataloging, especially if you kind of pay attention to what institution's putting it out. But again, we just went to that authority record by Library of Congress so you can know it exists and kind of what's in it. It is definitely more complicated to use, so don't feel like that should be your first line of defense. I really recommend you go and snoop through other cataloging that's already been done. Okay, so up next are places. So this is the name of places, geographic features that, again, we're really focusing on what the content of the material is that we want to highlight. So for Diana Denny, let's go look and see in her selected search terms. If we do a quick skim down the list, they don't mention any places. And again, you can just use what's relevant. And if there's nothing you want to highlight and there's no location that's very important to point out, you don't have to include it. For the Lucille Ball Desi Arnaz collection, or Desilu Productions collection, what do we want to highlight? So let's pretend for the sake of example that we know the studio was in Backlot, California, where the museum is as well. So again, to save time, I'm not going to do it, but we could go back to a catalog record much like this one and find one that lists locations, just kind of by snooping around and scrolling. And in doing so, we would find that multiple places were written in this format, where we have the town or the city name, and then there's a parentheses identification of the state. And I found other towns that were written exactly like this, so I just replaced the town name, and that becomes my standardized format for the place. So next up, for the next access point, we're talking about topics or subjects, as they call topical subjects. So what are the records about? What's the important aspects of what the records are about? So if we go to the Diana, our first example, our Diana finding aid, here they list them as subjects. So what can we learn by looking at this? So just by skimming this, we know this collection is about celebrities, and then they added more detail for the second little cuttered part called 1940 to 1970. So again, additional detail. People associated with politics and government. Remember, her caricatures were about, it mentioned specifically in the scope and content note that it was about a lot of politicians and government officials. And again, they added extra detail of the years. And finally, her work depicts scientists. And again, they added that extra detail of 1940 to 1970. So just scientists would be an official word, an indexed word, and then they added this extra detail onto the end. So what do we want to highlight in our Desilu collection? So I think it'd be good to point out all the celebrities that made guest appearances, because that could be really interesting to researchers. If we wanted to, we could also probably, in some category of information, we could point out the individual TV shows they were well known for, but for the sake of how much we know about the collection, we're not going to go into that. So we also want to point out that this was about television production or something adjacent, some word that's appropriate adjacent to that. So I'm going to start with the celebrities because I was inspired because Diana Denny also used this. So we know we can use the word celebrities. Here's how it's written officially. And if we want, we also see there already is the format laid out for us that if we do dash dash after celebrities, we can tack on extra detail or cutter years, more detail, so specifically about the years of those celebrities. So in our case, we could point out that it's from 1950 to, say, 1970 because of it being sold in 67. We'll just round up a little bit. Okay, so that takes care of our first one. We're just going to snatch from there. So now we want to see something about television production. So if we go back to the Online Archive of California, there's nothing really in the subjects of where we already are in the Arnaz collection that helps us. So let's go back to the home page and let's type in television production. Let's start with this first one. Again, I'm going to go to collection details over here in this right-hand table of contents menu. Scroll all the way to the bottom. Whoop, a little too far because this one actually has a lot of search terms. So they're calling them controlled access terms. And you'll see actually some of the celebrities that we had in our collection are listed in this one if you were looking for their names for some reason. So we're going to scroll down and we want to kind of get something that refers to this being about television production. And thanks to our search, so look, we have television history, television directors. So if it was really a lot about Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, and they were in the role of directors. We have television actors and actresses. So if we didn't want to list every single person who interacted with them and is a celebrity, but we wanted to know they were represented, we could put that in there. So you can kind of be as broad or specific as you want to be. But here's a word that I think would work really well to match what we're trying to describe. So we have television, and then we have that extra level of detail, so the dash dash, and this is production and direction. So for the case of just getting this description done, we are going to use that. Okay, next up is documentary forms. So these are terms that indicate the documentary forms is how it's described, and I like to think of it as the format of the materials that are in the collection. So what are the physical materials, or it could be even electronic materials, that are in the collection? And two control vocabularies that are listed to be helpful for this are the Library of Congress, as well as the Art and Architecture Thesaurus. That's what we're going to be looking at. As a reminder, we are also going to try to just borrow from things that already exist as much as possible. So if we look at the Diana Denny collection, we see here it's referred to as form/genre. So we can see that they have caricatures, and again, they've tacked on extra layer of details, which is optional, depends on what's useful to you and your patrons. Clippings, to refer to those newspaper clippings, they're called clippings. Drawings, and printing plates. So those are the types of formats that exist. So we have a lot of mixed materials in our collection. So for the sake of this example, I'm just going to pretend we're going to pull what the majority of the material is. So we're going to pretend we have the most of scripts, film reels, and correspondence. So even though there's only 15 film reels, maybe they contain really, really important information that we want to highlight to people that it exists. Or maybe it's a rare format that people are looking to do research on. So in this case, we want to highlight films, film reels, correspondence, and scripts. So how do we know what we need to call them to make those official terms to make searching easier? So first, let's go back to that finding aid at the Online Archive of California to see if they list any kind of types. So we have oral histories, that would be a format. Could be a format. They don't list a lot of formats. But if we go back to the first one we were looking at, we'll see that they have some formats. They have video recordings, slides, and personal papers, which are kind of formats. Not as specific as the Diana Denny one, though. So these aren't super helpful to us. We could keep looking. But for the sake of time and to show you another example, we are going to jump over to the Art and Architecture Thesaurus put out by the Getty Research Institute, because this is a great place to look for formats of materials. And there's a lot of tips and things of how to search, which you can explore at your own pace. So what was the first thing we wanted to look up? We wanted to look up film reels. So we're just going to start by putting what we call it and see if it gives us anything. Oh, so actually we have a search result for film reels. And if we click on it, it tells us right here, terms. We're looking for that word preferred, which means that's the word we should be using. So actually film reels with an S is exactly what we want to use. You can see the one underneath it says film reel, but it doesn't say preferred next to it. Also, there's one reels, comma, film, but it also doesn't have preferred next to it. So we want the preferred term, which is what we already had. So next, we want to describe the correspondence that we have. So let's go back, and I'm going to go to this little box in the top called New Search. And now let's try to see if correspondence is a word. Okay, so we got more results this time, but let's try to figure out which one we want. So commercial correspondence, maybe, but I wasn't really that specific because it's kind of personal and it's kind of business related. The second one just says correspondence, so that seems more in line with what I was thinking. Then we have correspondence artifacts. And then you can see legal correspondence, there's personal correspondence, there's all kinds of options, but I want to keep it simple. I want to be general, so we're just going to click on this correspondence word. So this time I want to point out, in addition to the terms we looked at, this note, because this note's actually going to be very helpful to make sure it's what we actually want to be saying. So it kind of gives us a little definition of like, what do they mean when they say correspondence? And this says any forms of addressed and written communications sent and received, including letters, postcards, memorandums, notes, telegrams, or cables. And we know ours are written letters, so this is the perfect word that we want to use. So let's look and make sure we know which one is the preferred word, and it's correspondent, singular. So that answers that question. So finally, what do we want? The last thing we wanted to highlight was scripts. Remember, those are those television scripts that were written. So we're going to do a new search. And I'm going to write scripts. So this brought up 4 pages of results. And we immediately may be like, oh, what we want's not here. And this is where sometimes you have to do a little research. If the kind of commonly used word is not what the official word is, you may have to kind of figure out what terminology you should actually be using. But what I noticed right away is they're saying Arabic scripts. So we're referring to like a language base. If you remember back to our language and scripts element, that's kind of getting pulled in here because, again, the computer doesn't really know what we mean. It doesn't know we mean television scripts. So I'm just going to browse down through this list and see kind of how broad it is. So we have, like, again, language scripts like cuneiform, exhibit scripts, so kind of everything. So I'm going to jump ahead. Let's try to jump to page 3. Oh, page 3 starts with radio scripts, so we're getting closer. It's getting to be a little more specific to what we want. Let's keep scrolling, just see what we can come up with. Okay, so now I have something down here called scripts writing and scripts documents. But I see underneath it says for oral or performed works. Well, acting's kind of a performed work, so let's see what this is. And again, this is where this note becomes important. So what does the note tell us it is? It says written text of stage plays, screenplays, and radio or television broadcasts. And for us, that's going to be good enough for what we want. So we are going to look for the preferred term called scripts with an S and then parentheses documents. Now, if for some reason we didn't find this exactly how we wanted to, you can go back, obviously, and look at other ones. So if we weren't sure, we could look at the scripts writing first and read the note. You can see that it's talking about distinct form. It's basically characters that are different than an alphabet. So that's talking more about those languages. So that's not what we want. So you can kind of read those descriptions. And you can also see, so if we knew, let me back up. If we knew radio scripts, like, oh, that's really close, but not quite what I want. We can click on radio scripts because we know it's really close to what we want. It's just the wrong format. And then if you see this little, it looks kind of like a little tree next to the word radio scripts right here. You can actually click on that tree. And again, this is built kind of like a hierarchy or like nested, starting broad and getting more and more specific in terms. So we can click on that to see all of the tree that comes before radio scripts. And you can see it's all kind of nested to walk down. And we actually see the word we ended up with, scripts document, is right before it. So if we click on that, we end up in the same place to describe written text, including radio, television broadcasts. So if you find a word that's very close, you can kind of walk up or down the tree to kind of navigate your way there. So with that, we found all the official standardized terms we want for documentary forms. Okay, the next section we have, next access point, is you can describe occupations if your collection, that's important to highlight for your collection. And again, there's kind of different lists you can use to do this. For Diana Denny, if we look at her collection, she's listed as an artist under her people name, but they don't give us a specific word for her. Oops, sorry about that. Under occupations for Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz in the production studio, we could use producer. We could point them out as producers. So again, we could do this by searching inside a catalog that already exists. So in this case, I'll go to the Library of Congress's finding aids, and we'll look for a producer. We'll see what that does. If we go to the second collection, I'm going to open it in a new tab just so you can kind of see another kind of finding aid. We'll see in this third tab over right here, we have something called index terms. And then we have different types of index terms. We have people, organizations, subjects, occupations. Let's see what's in occupations. So in this tab, we can see that we have a few occupations listed. We have authors, which doesn't pertain to us, but we also have television producers. So that's a word that sounds super relevant to what we were trying to look for. So if we go back to our slides, we can see that our idea to have something capturing producer now can become standardized, so that predefined list term that we all agree we're going to call it to television producers. And of course, depending on when you study the records and look at them, there may be other occupations that are represented in the records that you might want to point out to researchers, depending on their importance. And finally, there's a category called functions and activities. So these are terms as defined by DACS as terms indicating the functions, activities, transactions, and processes that generated material that's in the collection. Some examples that DACS gives, if we look down here, includes things like conservation efforts, regulations on hunting and fishing. So if you need some examples, you can see things like that there. So Diana Denny didn't have any of those, and we're not going to make any for the Lucille Ball collection. So I know we're a little long on time, but before we go, I do want to point one thing out about DACS, is that in this overview, it talks about access points. You can see we talked in some of the past classes about how sometimes you want to have that formatted data. So this kind of tells you where each of these access points might apply, where you might be seeing. So example, for the names, it might apply to creators, it might apply to the title element. So which elements may have these types of categories of information in them, just to be mindful of, or where you might want to pull access points from. So there's more information there if you want to dive into it. So with that, we've wrapped up access points and had a very brief taste of what controlled vocabulary lists are, and more importantly, how to mine for these terms from other places. Again, remember, consistency is the best thing you can do. So for those of you registered in the class who I'll see in the live workshop, we are going to analyze discovery tools to identify those access points and just learn how to kind of snoop for them. And then we'll also use our unstructured examples to make our own. So thank you for joining me, and I will see you in the next and final video of this course.